Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I'll never forget the day I found out my dad signed the family business over to my brother. It started as a normal Sunday dinner. The smell of roast chicken filled the kitchen, the table was set, and everyone was making small talk. Dad asked Jason about the car trouble he'd been having, while Mom reminded me to call Grandma because she hasn't heard from you in weeks. It was all so mundane. Nothing about that night prepared me for what was coming. Dad was halfway through slicing his second helping of chicken when he casually said, "Well, it's Jason's responsibility now." I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. "What do you mean, Jason's responsibility?" The room went quiet. Jason shifted in his seat, suddenly fascinated by the salt shaker. Mom's hand stilled, her fork poised over her plate. Dad looked at me, his tone as calm as if he were telling me the weather forecast. "The business. I signed it over to Jason a few months ago. He's been managing it anyway, so it just made sense to make it official." It felt like someone had pulled the rug out from under me. My mind scrambled to process what I'd just heard. My dad, the man who built our family business from the ground up, had handed it all over to my brother without so much as a conversation. "Wait," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You signed it over? Just like that? No heads up? No discussion?" Dad frowned like I was the one being unreasonable. "What's there to discuss? Jason's been running things for a while now. You've got your career. You've moved on. That's not the point," I said, my voice rising. "It's the family business. We grew up with it. I worked there for years. We all did. And you just handed it to him?" Jason finally spoke up, his voice low and defensive. "Aaron, it's not like that. I've been doing the day-to-day stuff. It makes sense. Does it?" I shot back. "Does it make sense to cut me out of the biggest decision in this family's history? Without even telling me?" Mom cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Aaron, your dad made the decision he thought was best. You've got your own career. You're doing so well. That's not the point, Mom." I snapped, cutting her off. "This isn't just about a job. It's about the principle. I deserve to know." I could feel the tension radiating around the table, but I didn't care. This wasn't just some minor oversight. This was the business we had all grown up around. I'd spent summers stocking shelves and keeping the books in order. Jason had helped out too, sure, but I'd always believed that when the time came, we'd run it together. That's what Dad always said when we were kids. "One day, this will all be yours," but now it was clear that yours meant Jason's. "You've got a good job," Dad said, his voice firm. "Jason's been here, working with me every day. You've got other things going on." This was the logical choice. I wanted to yell that this wasn't about logic, but I could see the conversation wasn't going anywhere. Dad had made his decision, and Jason clearly wasn't going to argue. The rest of dinner passed in stilted silence. Jason wouldn't meet my eyes, and Mom busied herself with asking pointless questions about the chicken recipe. By the time dessert came, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up abruptly. "I've got to go," I said, grabbing my coat. "Aaron, don't be like that," Mom pleaded. "Be like what?" I asked, my voice tight. "Upset that my dad handed over our family business without even telling me? Sorry if that's inconvenient." Before anyone could respond, I walked out the door. I spent the drive home fuming. Every mile I put between myself and that dinner table just seemed to make the betrayal sting more. This wasn't just about the business. It was about trust, about respect. How could my own family decide something so huge without even thinking to include me? By the time I pulled into my driveway, my anger had started to morph into something worse: hurt. I tried to justify their actions in my head. Maybe they didn't want to bother me. Maybe they thought I wouldn't care. But no matter how I spun it, I couldn't shake the feeling of being left out, like I didn't matter enough to even be part of the conversation. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, replaying the dinner over and over in my head. The words echoed in my mind. Jason's responsibility now? Logical choice. Logical for who? Certainly not for me. When I finally went inside, I poured myself a drink and stared at the wall, trying to make sense of it all. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't part of my own family. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a silent promise to myself. If they wanted me out of the picture, fine. I wouldn't fight for a place that clearly wasn't mine. But I couldn't help but wonder, if they didn't see me as part of the business now, would they ever? And if I wasn't part of the family legacy, where did that leave me? The days following that disastrous family dinner were some of the hardest I've ever endured. Every time I thought about my dad's words, Jason's responsibility now, I felt a wave of anger, hurt, and disbelief. Growing up, the family business had always felt like more than just a company. It was part of us, woven into the fabric of our lives. My dad had started it from scratch when I was a kid, working long hours to make it something he could be proud of. Jason and I grew up watching him pour his heart and soul into it. By the time we were teenagers, we were already helping out in whatever ways we could. For me, it was the bookkeeping. Dad had a knack for running the day-to-day operations, but hated dealing with numbers. I'd sit with him in the evenings, tallying receipts and making sure everything balanced. Jason, on the other hand, wasn't as involved. Sure, he helped out in the warehouse during summers, but he never had the same connection to the business that I did. Or so I thought. Apparently, none of that mattered. Jason hadn't just been handed a leadership role. He'd been given the entire business. Ownership, control, everything. I wasn't even offered a seat at the table, not as a partner, not even as an advisor. It was like Dad had decided I wasn't part of the equation anymore. I couldn't let it go. A few days after the dinner, I drove over to my parents' house to confront him. I waited until Jason wasn't there. I wasn't ready to deal with him yet. My mom let me in, her expression wary, like she already knew why I'd come. When Dad walked into the living room, I didn't waste any time. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why didn't you even think to talk to me about giving Jason the business?" He sighed, sitting down in his favorite chair. "Aaron, it wasn't something I did lightly. Jason's been working there for years. He knows how things run. Are you kidding me?" I said, pacing the room. "I work there too. I helped you keep the books, helped you expand, kept things organized when you were figuring out payroll. What about that? You've got a good career now," he said, his tone dismissive. "You've moved on, Aaron. Jason hasn't. This is his future." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. "So what? That means I don't get a say? That all those years I put in meant nothing?" "Of course it meant something," he said, his tone exasperated. "But this isn't about the past. It's about what makes sense for the future. Jason can't even pay his phone bill on time." I shot back. "How does that make him better suited to run an entire business?" Dad's response was a shrug, like he couldn't be bothered to argue. "He'll grow into it. Everyone has to start somewhere." And just like that, it hit me. This wasn't about logic or merit. It wasn't about who was better suited to run the business. It was about favoritism. Jason had always been the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. And me? I was the one expected to fend for myself. That realization hurt more than I expected. I'd always known Jason and I were different in Dad's eyes, but I thought it was subtle. I thought the business, at least, was neutral ground. But now I saw it for what it was. The family business wasn't just about numbers and contracts. It was a symbol of trust and legacy. And my dad had decided that Jason was the only one worthy of carrying it forward. I left their house that day feeling more like an outsider than ever. My mom tried to stop me at the door, saying something about how it wasn't personal and that Dad was just doing what he thought was best. But all I could hear were his words, Jason's future. Apparently, I wasn't part of it. For weeks, I tried to distract myself. I threw myself into work, spent more time with friends, anything to keep my mind off what had happened. But it was impossible to avoid. Every time I drove past the business, I felt a pang of resentment. Part of me wanted to walk away completely, to let them deal with whatever mess Jason was bound to make. But another part of me, the part that had spent years working alongside my dad, helping build something meaningful, couldn't let it go. I knew I shouldn't care. I had my own life, my own career. But that didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. The business was supposed to be ours. But now, it was clear that it had never been mine at all. For a while, I convinced myself it was none of my business. If my dad trusted Jason to take over, fine. Let them have it. I told myself I had my own life, my own career, and I didn't need to be involved in the family business. But as much as I tried to let it go, I couldn't stop the nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something wasn't right. At first, it was little things. I'd hear from family friends or former employees who mentioned that things weren't the same since my dad stepped back. Comments about missed deadlines, orders that were delayed, and a lack of communication. It was easy to brush off at first. Every business has rough patches, right? But then the complaints started piling up, and it became harder to ignore. I remember running into Mike, one of our longtime employees, at the grocery store. He was the kind of guy who had worked for my dad since the early days, loyal and hardworking. Seeing him was a surprise. He looked worn down, older than I remembered. "Mike, how's it going?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He gave me a tight smile. It's okay, I guess. Been better. What's going on? I asked, though I already had a feeling I wouldn't like the answer. Mike hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. It's not the same without your dad, he admitted. Jason doesn't know how to handle people. He's got no vision, no leadership. Things are falling apart over there, Aaron. I nodded, pretending to shrug it off, but his words hit me like a punch to the gut. This was my dad's legacy, and Jason was letting it crumble. The cracks in Jason's management became more apparent as the weeks went on. I heard from old colleagues that employees were leaving in droves. Jason was either too demanding or completely absent, depending on the day. Longtime clients were dropping us for competitors, saying they didn't feel valued anymore. The worst part was the financial rumors. Suppliers weren't getting paid on time, if at all. Bills were piling up, and Jason was taking out loans to cover basic operations. These weren't small loans either. They were the kind that came with sky-high interest rates, the kind you only take when you're desperate. Every time I heard a new piece of gossip about the business, it felt like another twist of the knife. I wanted to step in, to fix it, to help somehow. But what could I do? I wasn't part of the business anymore. Dad made that clear when he handed everything over to Jason. Better suited, Dad had said. I couldn't help but wonder if he was regretting those words now. One night, I decided to drive by the business, just to see it for myself. The parking lot, once bustling with cars and employees coming and going, was half empty. The lights in the office were dim, and the sign out front looked faded and unkempt. It was a stark contrast to the vibrant, thriving company I remembered from my childhood. As I sat in my car, staring at the building, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Maybe I should have fought harder for my place in the company. Maybe I should have pushed back against Dad's decision instead of walking away. But at the same time, how could I fix something I wasn't allowed to be a part of? I thought about calling my dad, but what would I say? I told you so didn't feel right, even if it was true. He was proud, and I knew he wouldn't admit to a mistake. Not yet. The breaking point came when I overheard a conversation between two former employees at a coffee shop. They didn't see me, and I wasn't about to interrupt, but their words stopped me cold. I heard Jason's trying to sell equipment to cover payroll. One of them said, "Seriously? That bad?" The other replied, "Worse. He's drowning in debt. It's just a matter of time before the whole thing goes under." Hearing that made my stomach churn. It wasn't just that the business was struggling. It was on the brink of collapse. I left the coffee shop in a daze, my mind racing. This was more than just bad management. Jason was actively sinking the company my dad spent decades building. I wanted to step in, to do something, but I felt powerless. Every time I thought about reaching out to my dad, I stopped myself. What was the point? He'd made his choice. He trusted Jason, and it was clear that trust had been misplaced. The hardest part was knowing I could have helped. I'd spent years working alongside my dad, learning the ins and outs of the business. I knew how to run it, how to keep things afloat. But none of that mattered now. This wasn't just a failing business. It was my dad's dream, his legacy, and it was slipping through Jason's fingers. And I was stuck on the sidelines, forced to watch it all fall apart. The call came late on a Wednesday night, and I knew something was wrong the moment my phone buzzed. My dad never called after 9 unless it was serious. I almost didn't pick up, but something told me to answer. "Hey, Dad," I said cautiously. "Aaron," he began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We need to talk." Just those 4 words were enough to send my stomach into a freefall. I hadn't spoken to him much since that disastrous family dinner, and any conversation we'd had since then was surface level, polite but distant. "What's going on?" I asked, bracing myself. There was a pause, the kind that stretches on just long enough to make your chest tighten. Then he sighed and said the words I'd been dreading, though I didn't realize it until that moment. "The business is bankrupt." I didn't say anything at first. What could I say? My mind was racing, replaying everything I'd seen and heard over the past few months. The rumors about unpaid bills, the empty parking lot, the whispers about debt. I should have seen this coming, but hearing it out loud still hit like a punch to the gut. "How?" I finally managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. "Jason," Dad's voice cracked. "He got in over his head, took out too many loans, made some bad deals. We couldn't recover." I could hear the shame in his voice, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. My dad wasn't the kind of man who admitted defeat easily. For him to even say the words, "we couldn't recover," meant things were far worse than I'd imagined. Part of me wanted to scream, "I told you so." Part of me wanted to ask why he trusted Jason so blindly. But the larger part of me just felt numb. This wasn't just a business going under. This was everything my dad had worked for. Everything he'd built from the ground up, gone. I thought that was the worst of it. Then he dropped the real bombshell. "We were hoping you could help," he said hesitantly. I blinked, not sure I'd heard him correctly. "Help?" "Yes," he said, his voice firm but tinged with desperation. "Jason doesn't know what to do, and you've always been good with numbers. You could step in, help us figure out how to keep things afloat." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After months of being excluded, after being told the business wasn't mine to worry about, now they wanted me to step in and fix it? "Dad," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "you gave the business to Jason. You made it his responsibility. Why are you asking me to clean up his mess?" "He's overwhelmed," Dad said. "He didn't realize how hard it would be. And I know you have the skills to fix it," I interrupted, the bitterness seeping into my tone. "You want me to fix it?" He didn't deny it. The conversation went on for another 10 minutes, but it all blurred together after that. Dad tried to explain how things had spiraled out of control, how Jason was struggling, how the family needed to come together to save what was left. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to tell him it wasn't my problem and that I wasn't going to bail Jason out. But part of me couldn't let go of the fact that this was my dad asking for help. For all his mistakes, for all the hurt he'd caused, he was still the man who'd built this business from nothing. "I'll think about it," I finally said, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. When we hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the wall. The weight of what he'd just told me pressed down on me like a physical force. The business was bankrupt. Jason had run it into the ground. And now, they were turning to me, the one person they'd left out of the decision-making process, to pick up the pieces. It was almost laughable. The next day, I tried to go about my routine, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept circling back to the conversation with Dad. Part of me felt vindicated. This was the exact scenario I'd warned them about. Jason wasn't ready to take on that kind of responsibility, and now everyone was paying the price. But another part of me felt a deep, gnawing sadness. The business wasn't just about money or pride. It was part of our family's story. I couldn't just watch it crumble, even if it wasn't my responsibility anymore. That night, I went through the old ledgers I'd kept from my time working with Dad. Seeing the numbers brought back memories of late nights spent at the dining room table, helping him balance the books. Back then, the business felt like something sacred, something worth protecting. I couldn't stop thinking about it. No matter how much I told myself it wasn't my problem, I couldn't let it go. A few days later, I called Dad back. "All right," I said. "I'll take a look at the books. But I'm not making any promises." "Thank you, Aaron," he said, relief flooding his voice. "That's all I'm asking." But we both knew it wasn't. They weren't just asking for advice. They were asking me to save them. And deep down, I wasn't sure if I could. When Dad first asked me to help, I said no. It wasn't an immediate, angry outburst. It was calm, deliberate, and sharp, like a clean break. "You gave Jason the business, remember?" I said. "This is his mess. Let him figure it out." I could feel the silence on the other end of the line, heavy with disappointment, but I didn't care. I'd spent months feeling like an outsider in my own family. They'd made it clear I wasn't part of their plans when they handed everything over to Jason without a second thought. Dad tried to argue, his voice filled with that tired, pleading tone he only used when he knew he was losing. "Aaron, this isn't just about Jason. It's about the business, the family legacy. We need you." But I wasn't ready to hear it. "You didn't need me when you gave it to him," I said bitterly. "Why do you need me now?" I ended the call before he could respond. The voicemail started the next day. "Just think about it," Dad said in one of them. "This isn't just for Jason. It's for the family. For everything we've built together. You're good at this stuff," he said in another. "You've always been good with numbers. I know you can help." I stopped listening after a while. Each message felt like a weight dragging me back into something I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of. But then Jason called. Hearing Jason's voice threw me off. We hadn't spoken since that awkward dinner when everything came to light. I half expected him to act defensive, to try to justify his decisions, but he didn't. "Aaron," he started, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from right now, but I need your help." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "I screwed up," he admitted. his words coming fast, like he was afraid I'd hang up before he could get them out. I thought I could handle it, but I can't. Everything's falling apart, and I don't know what to do. Hearing Jason beg was strange. He wasn't just my brother anymore. He was someone drowning, and for the first time, I saw the weight of the business crushing him. He didn't sound like the confident, easygoing guy who had shrugged off responsibility his entire life. He sounded desperate. "Why are you calling me?" I asked, my tone harsher than I intended. "Because you're the only one who can fix this," he said. "Dad believes in me, but I don't think I can do it. I don't want to ruin everything." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for me to say something. "I don't know if I can help," I said finally. "Even if I wanted to." "Please, Aaron," Jason said, his voice breaking. "I'm begging you. If not for me, then for Dad. For the business." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. Part of me wanted to let him sink. This was his mess, after all. He'd been handed the business on a silver platter, and he'd squandered it. Why should I be the one to clean up after him? But another part of me couldn't shake the image of my dad sitting at the dining room table, hunched over the books late at night, trying to make ends meet in the early days. The business wasn't just a company. It was the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. If I walked away, I wasn't just letting Jason fail. I was letting my dad's legacy crumble. The next morning, Dad called again. "I'll help," I said before he could launch into another speech. "But I have conditions." "Anything," he said immediately, relief flooding his voice. "First, Jason steps back completely," I said. "No more decisions, no more meddling. He listens to me or I'm out." "Done," Dad said without hesitation. "Second," I continued, "I'm not doing this for free. If you want me to save this business, I'm going to need full control. Ownership, decision-making power, everything. I'm not just coming in to clean up Jason's mess so he can take the reins again." There was a pause. "Aaron," Dad started, his tone hesitant. "No," I interrupted. "This is non-negotiable. If you want my help, you have to trust me to do it my way." There was another pause, longer this time. Then Dad sighed. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll talk to Jason." The weight of that decision didn't hit me until later. By agreeing to help, I wasn't just stepping into a failing business. I was stepping back into a family dynamic that had left me feeling bitter and betrayed. Part of me wondered if I was making a mistake. If Jason couldn't handle the pressure, what made me think I could? But another part of me knew I didn't have a choice. This wasn't about Jason anymore. It was about saving the one thing that tied our family together. And I wasn't sure if I could. I wish I could say I dove into the books with a sense of determination, ready to tackle the challenge head-on, but that would be a lie. The truth is, I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to sit at that desk, staring at years of Jason's mistakes, trying to untangle the financial equivalent of a train wreck. But I agreed to evaluate, and I wasn't going to back out, yet. When I first opened the files, it felt like I'd been dropped into the middle of a disaster zone. The spreadsheets were a mess of red ink, errors, and inconsistencies. Debt piled on debt, invoices unpaid for months, and loans with interest rates that could have been lifted from a payday lender's nightmare. "How did this happen?" I asked, my voice sharp as I pushed one of the balance sheets across the table toward Jason. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale under the fluorescent office lights. "We needed cash flow," he said, his tone defensive. "I thought the business could handle it." "You thought?" I snapped. "You thought the business could handle taking out multiple loans with 20% interest rates?" "Jason, this isn't just bad management. It's suicide." Jason shrugged, looking more like a chastened teenager than a grown man. "I didn't have a choice. We were behind on payments, and I needed to keep the lights on. I figured once we got a few big contracts, we'd catch up." "And did you get those contracts?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Jason didn't respond, which was answer enough. I pinched the bridge of my nose, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Jason, you can't run a business on wishful thinking. You can't just gamble on, maybe it'll all work out." "I know that now," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The deeper I dug into the finances, the worse it got. Bills from suppliers had gone unpaid for months. Payroll was inconsistent. Employees had either been paid late or, in some cases, not at all. Equipment leases were overdue, and the company had been slapped with multiple late fees. But the loans were what really made my stomach churn. Jason had taken out loan after loan, each one more predatory than the last. The amounts weren't even that large individually, but together they added up to a mountain of debt the business had no hope of climbing out from under. How did Dad let this happen? I muttered to myself as I flipped through another stack of papers. Jason, still sitting across from me, heard the comment and bristled. Don't blame Dad, he said quickly. He trusted me to handle it. I made some bad calls. Bad calls? I repeated, my voice rising. Jason, this isn't a few bad calls. This is a disaster. You've tanked the business. I didn't mean to, he shot back, his face flushed. I was trying to keep it afloat, okay? Do you think I wanted this to happen? We sat in tense silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. I turned back to the papers, flipping through transaction after transaction, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I looked, the more something didn't add up. Jason, I said slowly, where did the money go? What do you mean? He asked, his tone defensive again. I mean, even with all this debt, the numbers don't make sense. The business should have had more cash flow than this. Where's the money? Jason's eyes darted to the side, and my stomach sank. Jason, I said again, more firmly this time. Where is the money? He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Finally, he let out a long sigh. I might have used some of it for personal expenses. My jaw tightened. How much? A few thousand, he said quickly, avoiding my gaze. Jason, I said, my tone ice cold. How much? Okay, fine, he snapped. More than a few thousand. I don't know the exact number, but I had some stuff come up, and I thought I could pay it back later. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jason hadn't just mismanaged the business. He'd actively siphoned money out of it for his own use. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the full scope of what I was dealing with. The debt, the unpaid bills, the mismanagement. All of it was bad enough on its own. But now, knowing Jason had been using company funds for personal expenses, it felt like a slap in the face. What did you spend it on? I asked, my voice low and steady. Jason shrugged, trying to look casual but failing miserably. A car, some vacations, stuff like that. Stuff like that? I repeated, my voice rising again. Jason, this isn't monopoly money. This is the family business. People's livelihoods depend on this, and you blew it on vacations? I said I thought I could pay it back, he shouted, his voice cracking. I didn't think it would get this bad, okay? I'm sorry. His apology hung in the air, but it didn't make me feel any better. I gathered up the papers, stacking them neatly on the desk even though my hands were trembling with anger. Jason, this isn't just a mess. This is criminal. Do you understand that? You could have gotten us sued, or worse. I know, he said quietly, his head in his hands. I didn't say anything else. I couldn't. The enormity of what I was dealing with was overwhelming, and I needed time to think. As I left the office that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in way over my head. The business wasn't just failing, it was imploding, and somehow I was supposed to fix it. The question was, could it even be saved? And if it could, was it worth saving at all? I thought I'd seen the worst of it. After diving into the mountain of unpaid invoices, overdue loans, and mismanaged accounts, I figured there couldn't be any more surprises. But I was wrong. The deeper I dug into the financial records, the more inconsistencies started to surface. Payments had been made to vendors that didn't seem to exist. No invoices, no contact information, nothing. Withdrawals had been made at odd times, often in round numbers that didn't correspond to any business expense I could think of. At first, I chalked it up to poor bookkeeping. Jason had never been great with details, and I figured he'd just gotten sloppy. But the more I looked, the less it felt like sloppiness, and the more it felt like something deliberate. And then I found it. It was buried in the bank statements, almost like it was trying to hide. A series of transactions labeled as miscellaneous expenses caught my eye. At first, I thought they were legitimate. After all, every business has random costs that don't fit neatly into a category. But the amounts were suspiciously high, and the frequency was unusual. I started cross-referencing the transactions with the company's expense reports, and that's when things stopped making sense. There were no receipts, no corresponding entries in the ledger, nothing to explain where the money had gone. Finally, I pulled up one of the transactions on my laptop and traced it back to its source. What I found made my blood boil. Jason had been using the company account to pay for personal expenses. Not just small things either, big-ticket items. There was a payment for a luxury vacation in the Bahamas, complete with first-class flights and a five-star resort. Another for a brand-new SUV that cost more than most people's annual salaries. And then, the kicker. A massive withdrawal that went toward the down payment on a condo. All of this while the business was drowning in debt. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. This wasn't just mismanagement. This wasn't Jason being in over his head or making bad decisions out of desperation. This was theft. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. My first instinct was to storm into Jason's office and demand an explanation. But I knew that if I went in angry, I wouldn't get the truth. So I gathered the evidence, printouts of the bank statements, screenshots of the transactions, and waited until I could confront him calmly. When I finally walked into his office, Jason was sitting at his desk, scrolling through his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. "We need to talk," I said, shutting the door behind me. He looked up, startled by the tone in my voice. "What's up?" I dropped the printouts onto his desk. "What the hell is this?" Jason glanced at the papers, his face going pale. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "These are transactions from the company account. A vacation, a new car, a condo. You used company money for all of this, didn't you?" He looked like a deer in headlights, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the words. "It's not what it looks like," he said finally. "Really?" I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because it looks like you've been siphoning money from the business while it's falling apart. Care to explain how that's not what's happening?" Jason rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my gaze. "I was going to pay it back," he muttered. I needed the money at the time, and I thought things would get better." "You thought?" I said, my voice rising. "Jason, this isn't monopoly money. This is Dad's business, our family's legacy, and you treated it like your personal bank account." His defensiveness turned into anger. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad, okay? I was trying to keep things together. Do you think I enjoyed watching the business fail? Then why didn't you say something?" I shot back. "Why didn't you ask for help instead of digging yourself into a deeper hole?" "I didn't want to disappoint Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "He trusted me, and I didn't want him to think I couldn't handle it." I stared at him, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "So instead, you stole from the business and lied to everyone." "Great plan, Jason." He didn't respond. The silence between us was deafening. Part of me wanted to keep yelling, to make him feel the full weight of what he'd done. But another part of me just felt tired. "This isn't just a mistake," I said finally. "This is betrayal. You didn't just let the business fail. You betrayed Dad's trust, Mom's trust, my trust. And for what? A vacation? A fancy car?" Jason slumped in his chair, burying his face in his hands. "I know I messed up," he said, his voice muffled. "I don't know how to fix it." For the first time, I saw the cracks in his armor. Jason wasn't just defensive or arrogant. He was scared. He'd dug himself into a hole so deep he couldn't see a way out. But that didn't mean I was ready to forgive him. I left his office without saying another word, the printouts still scattered across his desk. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't stop replaying the confrontation in my head. Jason's actions weren't just reckless, they were selfish. He'd put his own comfort above the survival of the business, above the well-being of the employees who depended on us, above our family's legacy. And now, somehow, it was my job to clean up the mess. For the first time since I agreed to help, I seriously considered walking away. Let them deal with the fallout. Let Jason face the consequences of his actions. But then I thought about Dad. No matter how angry I was, no matter how betrayed I felt, I couldn't let his life's work go down in flames. I didn't know how, but I was going to fix this. And Jason? He was going to learn what it meant to take responsibility, whether he liked it or not. The morning after I confronted Jason, I knew I couldn't keep what I'd found to myself. I'd spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to shield my dad from the truth. He'd already been through so much, and I wasn't sure how much more he could take. But I also knew that hiding it wasn't an option. If we were going to have any chance of salvaging the business, or what was left of it, Dad needed to know exactly what had happened. So, I took the printouts of the bank statements, tucked them into a folder, and drove to my parents' house. Dad was in the kitchen when I arrived, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window. He looked older than I remembered, the weight of the past few months etched into the lines on his face. "Aaron," he said when he saw me, his voice weary but warm. "You're here early. Everything okay?" "No," I said bluntly, setting the folder down on the table. We need to talk. He gave me a questioning look but sat down without a word, his eyes flicking to the folder. I opened it and slid the papers across the table toward him. What's this? He asked, frowning as he picked up the top sheet. Proof that Jason's been using company money for personal expenses, I said. The room went silent. I watched his face as he scanned the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief and finally to something that looked a lot like heartbreak. This can't be right, he said, shaking his head. Jason wouldn't do that. You must be mistaken. I'm not, I said firmly. I've gone through everything, Dad. These transactions don't match any legitimate business expenses. Jason admitted it to me yesterday. He stared at the papers for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. Finally, he set them down and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, heavy sigh. I trusted him, he said, his voice breaking. I thought he'd take care of it. I thought he understood what this business meant. For the first time, I saw just how deeply this had hurt him. This wasn't just about the money or the failing business. It was about trust. My dad had believed in Jason, had handed him the reins of the family legacy, and Jason had thrown it all away. I should have seen it, Dad said, rubbing a hand over his face. I should have known he wasn't ready, but I wanted to believe he could do it. It's not your fault, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure if I believed it. Jason made his own choices. Dad didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the papers like they held all the answers, or maybe all the regrets. The fallout was immediate. That evening, Dad called Jason and told him he wanted to meet. I wasn't there for the conversation, but I heard about it later from my mom. Apparently, it didn't go well. Jason tried to defend himself at first, saying he'd planned to pay the money back and that he hadn't meant for things to get so out of control. But Dad wasn't having it. You lied to me, he told Jason, his voice cold and unyielding. You lied to your family, and you betrayed the trust one put in you. According to Mom, Jason looked like he'd been slapped. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. I didn't have a choice, he said. I was trying to keep the business alive. You don't know what it's been like. The pressure. The pressure? Dad interrupted. Do you think I didn't feel pressure when I was building this business from nothing? Do you think I ever once took shortcuts like this? You didn't just make bad decisions, Jason. You were selfish. And now, everyone else has to deal with the consequences. By the time the conversation ended, Jason had stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. After that, things were never the same. Dad stopped talking to Jason altogether. He wouldn't take his calls, wouldn't respond to his messages. Jason, in turn, stopped coming around. The house felt quieter, emptier, like the unspoken tension had sucked all the life out of it. And then there was me. Jason refused to speak to me after our confrontation. In his eyes, I was the one who'd betrayed him by going to Dad. Never mind the fact that he was the one who'd put us in this position in the first place. It felt like our family was fracturing, each of us standing on separate islands, unable or unwilling to reach out to one another. Mom tried to play peacemaker, as she always did. She called me one afternoon, her voice tight with worry. Can't you talk to him? She asked. Jason's not perfect, but he's still your brother. This family has been through enough. Mom, I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. Jason did this to himself. I'm not going to pretend everything's fine just to keep the peace. But he's hurting, she said. You both are. I didn't know how to respond to that. Maybe she was right. Maybe we were both hurting, in different ways. But that didn't change the fact that Jason had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure if our relationship or the family could ever recover. For weeks, I felt like I was walking through a minefield. Every interaction with my parents was tinged with tension. Every thought of Jason brought a mix of anger and sadness. The business was still in shambles, and the weight of trying to fix it felt heavier than ever. I'd agreed to help save the company, but now I wasn't sure if there was anything left to save, of the business or of our family. The call came late one evening while I was still at my desk, trying to make sense of the chaos Jason had left behind. Dad's voice on the other end was quieter than usual, a tone that immediately put me on edge. I need to see you, he said. We need to talk. I was tempted to say no. These conversations always left me feeling drained, and I wasn't in the mood for another round of guilt or pleading. But something in his voice stopped me. Fine, I said. Tomorrow morning. When I arrived at my parents' house the next day, Dad was already waiting for me in the living room. He looked older than I remembered. His shoulders slumped and his face lined with exhaustion. Thanks for coming, he said as I sat down across from him. What's this about? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. I know things have been difficult lately, he began. And I know you're angry. But the business is worth saving. If we all work together, I think we can bring it back. I stared at him, incredulous. We? I said. Who's we, Dad? Because the last time I checked, Jason has done nothing but make things worse. He made mistakes, Dad admitted. Big ones. But he's still part of this family. We can't just throw him away. I shook my head, the anger bubbling up again. This isn't about throwing him away. It's about accountability. Jason destroyed the business and betrayed everyone's trust. Why should I be the one to clean up his mess? Dad sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. Because you're the only one who can, Aaron. You've always had a head for this stuff. You're organized, disciplined. You see things clearly. Jason, he doesn't have that. And yet you gave him the business, I said bitterly. I made a mistake, Dad said, his voice breaking. I thought he could handle it. I thought if I gave him that responsibility, he'd rise to the occasion. Well, he didn't, I shot back. I know, Dad said quietly, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But this isn't about Jason anymore. His words stopped me cold. What do you mean? I asked. This isn't about Jason, he repeated. It's about us. The family. The business. It's about what this company has always meant to us. I didn't respond right away. His words hung in the air, pulling at something deep inside me. I built that business from nothing, Dad continued. It wasn't easy. Your mom and I made a lot of sacrifices to get it off the ground. And yes, Jason failed. He let us all down. But if we let the business die, we lose more than money. We lose part of who we are. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine. I need your help, Aaron. Not for Jason. For the family. I wanted to say no. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to walk away, to let them deal with the mess they'd created. But then, images of the past started flooding my mind. Late nights sitting at the dining room table with Dad, helping him balance the books. Weekends spent organizing inventory in the warehouse. The pride in his eyes when he showed me the first big contract he'd landed. The business wasn't just a company. It was part of our family's story, a symbol of everything we'd built together. I need time to think, I said finally. Take all the time you need, Dad said. But please, don't let this be the end. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. Part of me still wanted to walk away. Jason had made his choices, and he needed to face the consequences. But another part of me, the part that remembered the pride and determination in Dad's voice when he talked about the business, felt a pull I couldn't ignore. Finally, I called Dad back. I'll do it, I said. But I have conditions. Anything, he said immediately. First, I said, Jason is completely out. No decision-making power, no input, nothing. If I'm going to save this business, I need full control. Done, Dad said. Second, I need you to back me 100%. If Jason tries to interfere, you have to shut him down. You have my word, Dad said. The conversation ended, but my mind was already racing. I knew what I was agreeing to wasn't going to be easy. The business was in shambles, and the road to recovery would be long and grueling. But I also knew that if I didn't step in, no one else would. This wasn't about Jason anymore. It was about saving the one thing that had always tied our family together. And for better or worse, I was going to try. In the end, I agreed to help. But I made it clear from the start, Jason had to step away completely. It wasn't negotiable. No more half-hearted attempts at leadership, no more backdoor deals or excuses. If I was going to salvage what was left of the business, and by extension, our family's legacy, Jason couldn't be involved. Dad hesitated when I laid out the condition. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the tug-of-war between his loyalty to Jason and his desire to see the business survive. But he finally nodded, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the decision. I'll talk to him, he said quietly. Jason didn't take the news well. He called me the day after Dad told him, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. So that's it, he snapped. You're just cutting me out? You cut yourself out, Jason, I said, keeping my tone steady. You did this, not me. I'm just trying to clean up the mess you left behind. I made mistakes, he admitted, his voice softening. But I'm still part of this family. Don't I deserve a chance to fix things? You had your chance, I said, my patience wearing thin. Now it's my turn. He didn't have a response for that. The first few weeks were chaos. Every time I opened a new file or combed through another report, I found a new problem. Unpaid invoices, unfulfilled contracts, and suppliers who were so fed up they refused to work with us anymore. The employees who hadn't already quit were on the verge of walking out. Morale was at an all-time low, and I couldn't blame them. They'd been left in the dark for months, forced to deal with the fallout of Jason's incompetence. I called an all-hands meeting on my first day back. Standing in front of that room, facing a group of people who had every reason to resent me, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I know things have been rough, I said, addressing the room. I know you've been let down. But I'm here now, and I'm going to do everything I can to turn this around. There were no cheers, no enthusiastic nods of agreement, just wary stares and crossed arms. I couldn't blame them for their skepticism. It's not going to be easy, I continued. We're in a tough spot, and there's no quick fix. But if you stick with me, I promise you this, I won't let you down. It wasn't a rousing speech, but it was honest. And for now, that would have to be enough. Rebuilding the business has been the hardest thing I've ever done. Some days, it feels impossible. The debt Jason racked up still looms over us like a storm cloud, and every step forward seems to come with 2 steps back. But for the first time in months, there's a glimmer of hope. The suppliers who initially refused to work with us have started returning my calls. A few of the old clients have come back, cautiously testing the waters to see if we're serious about getting our act together. It's slow progress, but it's progress nonetheless. As for my family, that's a more complicated story. Dad is a shell of the man he used to be. He still comes to the office occasionally, but it's clear the past few months have taken a toll on him. I catch him staring out the window sometimes, lost in thought. Jason, on the other hand, has all but disappeared. We haven't spoken since the day I told him he had to step away, and I don't know if we ever will. Part of me wants to reach out, to try and salvage what's left of our relationship. But another part of me, the part that remembers the betrayal, the lies, and the mess he left behind, isn't ready to forgive him. Mom keeps trying to hold us all together, as she always does. She calls me every few days, checking in and offering words of encouragement. But I can hear the strain in her voice. She's torn between loyalty to Jason and support for me, and it's wearing her down. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if the business will survive, or if I'll ever be able to look at Jason without feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. What I do know is that I'm not the same person I was before. This experience has changed me, in ways I'm still trying to understand. I've learned the hard way that family doesn't always mean trust. That sometimes, the people closest to you are the ones who let you down the most. But I've also learned that I'm stronger than I thought. That even in the face of betrayal and failure, I can keep going. This isn't the ending I wanted. It's not even an ending, really. It's just where things are for now. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough.